As our tradition, if we may recite the full weight test of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
You guys today. Obviously, I'm speaking with a number of business people, so hopefully the presentation today will be of interest and relevance to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the corporate responsibility to respect human rights and a very pivotal moment that had occurred in around June 2011 in terms of fostering international consensus around what exactly that means and what that means in practice for companies in terms of how they operate on a day-to-day basis. So let me just kind of set the stage for you first a little bit, because while there's new international consensus around this concept of a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, it's not really completely new to the extent that we've always asked ourselves, what exactly is the role of business in society? To whose benefit should companies be created? The earliest corporations were incorporated mostly for public purposes and not private ones. Who bears liability when something unfortunately goes wrong? Is it the managers, the shareholders, the investors? The notion of a limited liability corporation had to also first be created itself. How do we best regulate companies, in particular companies that operate on a global scale, right, across borders? It raises trans-border issues around, for example, how a home state where a company is headquartered should seek to exercise and influence corporate behavior in another jurisdiction. A lot of tricky issues raised around that. Who's responsible for collective goods? Companies utilize collective goods that belong to all of us in a country and as a planet, as a global community. So who makes sure that we protect those kind of natural resources that companies often depend upon? And what kind of rights and responsibilities should we assign to companies? Under US law, companies are fictitious persons and are granted certain rights, but with rights also come correlate duties. And what should those be? So these are the kind of questions that we've struggled with, and companies as well, because companies need to maintain what's called the social license to operate. In other words, companies need to be accepted by the communities in which they operate. And obviously many of you know that. You're here fostering your community in the Lancaster area. But how does one do that best? And companies have come up with a number of ways to do so, through corporate philanthropy and giving, through various efforts to ensure that their activities are environmentally and socially sustainable, through various types of community engagement with the stakeholders they impact upon, and through various types of corporate social responsibility initiatives. But what we saw happening, in particular beginning in the 1990s with the growth of economic globalization, is there was a little more uncertainty in terms of what this means for how companies should behave and act. In particular, because there's a sense that in some ways voluntarism is not enough. It's great when companies are, responsible and engaged in philanthropy, but they still need to be regulated and held accountable should things go wrong. And there should be, in particular, also remedy for those who might suffer a harm as a result of corporate activities. So this was part, as I said, of a larger global trend. With the end of the Cold War, you had a lot of new markets emerging, and you had an increase in flows of trade and investment across borders. But with that came other things: deregulation by governments of corporate activities, an increased privatization of certain activities that were before a responsibility of governments, think like private prisons, think schooling and other things. And you had a situation where companies were at times investing in countries that didn't have strong governance in place, or countries who wanted to draw foreign direct investment by, frankly, not enforcing regulations they had on the books. So these trends resulted in a growing awareness, in particular in the public, of the kind of potential, unfortunately, harms that some global corporations could have when they operated globally. Now, this wasn't just an issue in terms for those who were affected by these activities. It was also an issue for the companies themselves, because it posed new types of potential risks and liabilities. There were reputational liabilities in terms of, should this hit the headlines, what does it mean for me as a company and this brand that I spent years building up? In terms of legal liabilities, potential lawsuits, even when activities happen overseas, there are ways to use civil lawsuits to hold companies accountable. Operational risks. If I am an extractive company and I'm working in a community that's opposed to the project, I may end up having to shut down my project because of protests. And then other types of financial liabilities as well. So let's talk just briefly, hopefully some of you remember these incidents, but these are really just examples of pivotal incidents that brought these questions to the forefront. 1984, Bhopal, Union Carbide, now owned by Dow Chemical, a massive leak in the factory that resulted in thousands of deaths, and unfortunately there's continuing health problems for the communities there. Organizations became very active in terms of trying to ensure access to remedy for those people, and lawsuits are still ongoing. Exxon Valdez, the biggest oil spill until Deepwater Horizon, unfortunately, but Exxon had to pay millions in terms of cleanup. Shell, sorry, that was really loud. In the Niger Delta, Shell's been one of the big oil companies extracting oil there, had created some serious environmental concerns. People in the Ogoni community became very active, and unfortunately 9 activists were hanged. Shell was accused of being complicit in giving information to the Nigerian government that actually led to a guilty verdict and his hanging, along with 8 others. Shell was sued through the Alien Tort Statute and had to settle for $15.5 million. These are the kind of liabilities we're talking about. One final example, I'm sure you probably all remember in the 1990s, there was this growth of the anti-sweatshop movement. I remember being on my campus, very active. And this was interesting because Nike never actually owned any of the factories where these types of labor rights abuses were occurring. But talking about the social license to operate, in some ways that didn't matter. Nike's customers viewed it as being responsible for the conditions in its supply chains. And Nike had to then, of course, react and try to take efforts to better conduct due diligence on its supply chains. So these kind of pivotal moments really kind of foster this realization that there's something out there called governance gaps. And John Ruggie, who's a UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, really captured this idea well in this quote, I think, right? It's the idea that you have this growing reach of companies who are often very powerful relative to the countries in which they're investing, and they're having a tremendous impact. But the impact of those business forces, those economic forces, can't always be counteracted when necessary by the local communities and governments. So you have this growth of gaps where unfortunate incidents like the ones we just discussed can occur. And so the question becomes, how do we close these gaps? And this is a question that the UN really started working on, I'd say, probably in the early 2000s. And what resulted was, in 2011, unanimous consent in the UN Human Rights Council on something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And basically what Ruggie was tasked with by then former Secretary General Kofi Annan was to try to identify and clarify what kind of existing standards are already out there in terms of best practices for businesses in terms of ensuring that they respect human rights. And then also, what's the role of governments relative to business activities and ensuring that people's rights are respected? And then Ruggie was asked to also clarify certain key concepts like, what does it mean to have a company complicit in human rights abuses? It's states, not companies, that are responsible under international human rights treaties. So what does that mean? What kind of influence do companies have? We talk about these big global companies that are so powerful with revenues that exceed some of the GDPs of other countries. So what kind of influence can we expect companies to exercise? So what happened was then, the UN Guiding Principles were agreed upon, and it reflects what's called the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. And I'm going to take you through these 3 pillars of the UN Guiding Principles one by one. So the state duty protect, this is a fairly obvious one, right? It's that ultimately states sign on to human rights treaties, ratify them, implement them in national law. So ultimately it's states who are responsible for ensuring that people's rights are protected from abuses by economic actors, to include companies. And states should use whatever means they have at their disposal to do so. Laws, regulations, judicial action, that sort of thing. That's standard. That's all, we know that's what it means when states are responsible for ensuring that rights are protected. Now what was new was the corporate responsibility to respect. And as John Ruggie said, it was based on an expectation that we all have. And that's simply that when companies operate, they should do no harm. There's no problem with companies operating, earning profits for their investors, for their owners, their shareholders, what have you. But when they do so, they shouldn't do harm in the process. And rather, they should act with what's called due diligence to avoid infringing upon the rights of people when they operate. And then, should that unfortunately happen, which occurs even in the best companies, they should try to take steps to ensure that those wrongs are remedied in some way or another. Now, what's interesting is this expectation exists independent of whether or not states are living up to their responsibility to ensure that rights are protected. So that means if you're a company, let's say you're operating in China, the Chinese government, unfortunately, does not respect all rights. And if you are there in China operating, you must do your best to try to ensure that the rights you impact on are respected to the fullest extent possible, given the operating context. Now, I just want to real quickly take you through kind of some of the three core elements or prongs of this corporate responsibility to respect. In practice, it entails three things. First, a policy commitment. Companies should, at the highest levels of management, commit to respecting human rights in their operations. And that commitment needs to be embedded throughout the company in how the business is managed, how it's run on a day-to-day basis. All of your people in your company should know that you've made this commitment. It's really about incorporating that commitment into your business. All companies should undertake a human rights due diligence process. Very simple, many companies already do this. This is about what I say risk management. Know and identify your potential risks in terms of your ability to impact on human rights, not just negatively, positively as well, and then understand those, and where there's potential for negative impact, or there's actually a negative impact has occurred, and then take steps to mitigate those risks and address them. And then thirdly, enable remediation, and that entails a couple things. That entails making good what potentially has already gone wrong, but it also entails a continual improvement process. Put in place a corporate grievance mechanism so that anybody who feels they've been negatively impacted by your company can actually go and file a complaint. That shouldn't be a scary thing. It's a great way of identifying ahead of time before things go really wrong and you become the Shell, the Nike, whomever, that something is up and you can address it. Now, the third pillar in that protect, respect, and remedy framework is this idea of remedy. And here, both states and businesses have to work together to ensure that any wrongs are righted, so to speak. And as Roddy points out, this is because even the best run businesses have all the right commitments, have undertaken a human rights due diligence process, can still potentially negatively impact on human rights. And the remedy can entail different things. It could be through judicial mechanisms, it could be through non-judicial mechanisms, like a corporate-based grievance process. So there are many possibilities as to how to make this happen. Now, as I hinted at the outset, in some ways, the UN guiding principles are nothing new. Let me tell you why they're, first of all, nothing new. They're nothing new because in terms of the state responsibility to protect human rights, that's always existed, right? Any state that signs a human rights treaty, any state that's a member of the United Nations has already committed to protecting human rights of its citizens and of others people around the world as well. Even in some ways, the corporate responsibility to respect is nothing new. As I said before, it's a basic expectation, societal expectation. Companies should not do harm while making a profit, right? We don't deem that to be acceptable. But what is new? This is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach for companies. Companies are going to need to figure out for themselves what that means in practice, because companies in different industries impact on different human rights in very different ways. So it's really first about coming to terms with what you as a company, how you're operating, how you need to think about how you manage your human rights risks. And the tools to do so, I mean, I'll be very honest, they're still being developed. There's a number of good tools out there in terms of how to do a human rights impact assessment, how to integrate that into your risk management process. There's good tools out there in terms of how to report on what you're doing, to also garner benefit from the kind of commitments you've made. But it's still somewhat new, so companies are still working, trying to figure out what it means. Now, which human rights can companies impact on? Really, almost all of them. And the UN guiding principles, and this is my favorite picture of Eleanor Roosevelt holding a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the International Bill of Rights, it covers three things. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor is holding there, that's just a declaration in the sense of it was agreed upon by the international community in 1948. It was a direct response to World War II and the kind of atrocities that occurred during World War II. And then that kind of declaration, the commitments in it to those 30 principles on human rights were then codified in 2 covenants. Covenants then have legally binding effect, right? And those were covenants on civil and political rights and covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights. In addition to that, there are core International Labor Organization conventions that cover some basic rights at work. So these, at a minimum, according to the UN guiding principles, are the human rights that companies can potentially impact again. Understanding, of course, that it's industry specific. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time actually talking about what human rights are. Just, it's basically what all of us need to live a life of dignity, and that's really what they're about. And they apply to everybody equally. It doesn't matter how you identify yourself through, what kind of identifying factors, your race, your religion, your gender, what have you. And they're universal, inalienable, indivisible, and interdependent. So everyone's got them no matter what. They can never be taken away. Rights, they all cohere as a coherent whole. So civil and political rights are equally important as economic and social and cultural rights. It's not a language we use a lot necessarily in the US. We tend to talk of civil and political liberties, but this is how to think about what people's needs are in a more holistic fashion. They're interdependent, right? If I don't have a right to an education, I don't become literate. It's very hard for me to participate in the political process. I can't enjoy my right to physical security if I don't have my basic needs covered, food, housing, that sort of thing. So they're really interdependent. This is a quick picture I just want to show you because I like it. It's by a man named René Cassin. He actually won a Nobel Prize for his work in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, together, of course, with others. He wasn't alone. But I think it's just a nice way of thinking about how all rights are really interrelated. You see the 4 pillars there. They stand equally to each other to hold up this wonderful portico, a doorway into a better world, where what happens in that better world, people can live with dignity. They live together as community and brotherhood. They have liberty and equality in that community. So I think this is just a nice picture to kind of think about human rights. Now, that being said, it's not always clear how companies should go about respecting human rights. I mean, let's be honest, those are very high-level principles, right? So how do companies actually operationalize that? And that's not always the clearest thing. Companies can face dilemmas when trying to do their best to ensure that they respect human rights. Let me just go through some of them. Oftentimes, a responsible intervention by a company can lead to unforeseen consequences. What do I mean with that? Well, for example, there was a problem in the apparel industry, we talked about Nike before, with child labor. The problem is, in many poor countries, while it's unfortunate that children work, and we certainly don't encourage that or want that, the children have few options. So when one takes a child out of a factory, the child unfortunately can end up in much more precarious situations on the street. So unintended consequence. Doesn't mean that child labor is okay. It means there's better ways of dealing with child labor. Oftentimes, there are various stakeholders impacted by corporate activities, and they may have very different perspectives in terms of what the best solution for them is. So, for example, we talked before about Shell. Extractive companies often operate in communities. Communities are not a monolithic whole. You might have community members who are highly opposed, let's say, to an oil project, but at the same time, other community members may benefit. They may have gotten jobs from the project they didn't have before. So how do you satisfy stakeholder interests and rights in situations like that? Not always clear. So we talked about both state and corporate responsibilities, but where are the boundaries? I mean, ultimately, it is the state that is elected and governs and holds companies and individuals to account. Where should those boundaries lie? Another factor is in terms of vis-a-vis business partners. The UN Guiding Principles talks about the fact that companies should be aware of also their business relationships and how those might impact on human rights. So like the Nikes of the world, Nike had become very familiar with subcontractors, right? But Nike, as I said before, doesn't own them technically. So its ability to influence its subcontractors may be somewhat limited. Nevertheless, companies need to think about how to exercise that influence if possible. Companies often cannot address the root causes of human rights abuses, right? I mean, that's a given. They're operating in areas that are very unstable sometimes, where governments have failed or are failing, where governments might be corrupt. We know about situations like this around the world, so there's limits to what companies can do at times. And it's not always clear what the greatest good is when there's many possible goods, nor what the least worst course of action is when no course of action is perfect. So these are important things and that companies have to think through. And then the biggest one, which I think is probably the root cause of a lot of these issues, is that there's conflicts at times between local laws, norms, mores, and international human rights standards, right? There's conflicts there because international human rights are in many ways an invention of the Western world. It's not that other countries have not committed to them, they have, and they're responsible, therefore, to ensure that they're being respected and protected and implemented, but nevertheless, there's often gaps. I mean, one good example we can all probably think of at the top of our head is the treatment of women in other parts of the world, right, where women are not considered equals in society to their male counterparts. So what can companies do in face of these types of dilemmas? A couple things. Seek expert advice. There's a number of companies who are considered leaders in their industry who've been doing this for a while. I can think of a few just off the top of my head, like Nestle, Unilever, Coca-Cola, BP. These companies have all been struggling with these issues. And normally, if you're in an industry, your trade association might be able to assist in trying to learn best practices from your colleagues. Oftentimes in industries, there's multi-stakeholder initiatives where government actors, civil society actors, and companies have come together to work through these issues and try to identify solutions. Consult with the industry peers, and then engage with both state and non-state stakeholders, and we covered that. Now, despite these dilemmas and knowing it's not easy, this expectation is there. It's really gaining a strong footing. So you see here the countries which have started developing what are called national action plans to implement and operationalize their commitment to the UN Guiding Principles. The green are ones that are already done. This is a little bit dated. The United States, as I'll talk about in a second, already has an action plan in place, as does Germany and Switzerland as well. And so what's happening is not only that these national action plans are being developed by governments, but you also have existing standards being updated against and benchmarked against the UN Guiding Principles. So those of you who might be familiar with ISO, the International Organization for Standardization Standards, ISO 26000 is a corporate responsibility standard that was updated to incorporate elements of the UN Guiding Principles. I helped draft a standard for private security operations, ISO 18788. One of the normative references in that is the UN Guiding Principles. So you really see these becoming kind of par for the course in terms of an expectation for the industry. You have organizations pushing companies to implement these standards, and you have a number of companies who are actually going out there and test piloting implementation. Unilever, I mentioned before, is one of them, as well as a number of others. So here, in terms of here in the United States, this is a cover shot of the U.S. National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct. In December 2016, late in the Obama administration, after 2 years of work and extensive multi-stakeholder consultations around the United States, the U.S. government released its first National Action Plan for Responsible Business Conduct. And this action plan is really about the U.S. government explaining what it's already doing and what it plans to do in order to encourage responsible business conduct around the world. Now, it was based on the idea that U.S. companies are already leaders in the world, right? That they lead by example in terms of following the rule of law, upholding human rights in their operations, strengthening the communities in which they operate through their investments, through job creation and that sort of thing. And it goes on. I don't want to go into too many specifics here. You can look at it online. There's literally hundreds of initiatives that are listed there, new and old, but they fall into 5 categories. Examples of where the U.S. can lead through international organizations, through bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements in terms of fostering responsible business conduct, collaborating with stakeholders in various types of multi-stakeholder initiatives. As I said before, almost every industry has one. For the extractives industry, it's the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. For the apparel industry, it's the Fair Labor Association. For the information and communication technologies companies, it's the Global Network Initiative. These are all forums where the U.S. government plans to commit its time and efforts to fostering the shared efforts to find solutions to challenges. Facilitating responsible business conduct, providing resources to companies. If you're a company about to go in a very unstable environment, the U.S. government might offer you various types of information and tools to help you better assess and address your risks. Recognizing positive performance, the State Department has an award it gives leading companies who display responsible conduct, and then helping to provide access to remedy to victims of abuses, primarily through what's called national contact points of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Every country has one, we do too. But there's still a long way to go. This National Action Plan, it is a beginning. Unfortunately, it was not based on a baseline assessment of where we are in terms of existing U.S. laws and regulations and initiatives, how far they go towards fostering responsible business conduct. There was no effort to really look kind of more industry specific at what types of human rights issues various industries might face. Unfortunately, obviously, the UN Guiding Principles really apply to businesses everywhere. Someone else's overseas is someone else's domestic. But there's not a lot of focus on what companies have to do here in the U.S. There's a focus on highlighting existing initiatives instead of newer ones, and there's really not, it's vague on specifics, and there's few benchmarks against which to assess implementation. Now, that being said, it's also unfortunately not quite clear what will become of the U.S. National Action Plan under the new Trump administration, but No doubt, this is becoming a global standard. Many US companies operate around the world, so even if the US backs away a little bit from its commitment to responsible business conduct and fostering it, those companies are still going to be faced with similar expectations in other countries around the world where they operate. So what's this mean for companies? Don't wait and see. That's the worst you can do. Talk to some of the bigger companies that have actually faced issues, as I mentioned before, the liabilities, legal, reputational, operational. Don't let that happen to you. Figure out now what kind of issues you might face. Develop a human rights policy. Build it into your management systems. Have good management systems in place that allow you to run your business better. Do a risk analysis. Figure out how you might potentially, both, as I said before, positively and negatively impact on human rights. Address your negative impacts. Continue to promote your positive impacts. Identify and engage with other stakeholders. Do not make the mistake of thinking you can do it all in-house. You know, reach out to communities in which you operate, reach out to human rights experts, reach out to risk management experts, reach out to specialists who understand the environments in which you operate. Create effective grievance mechanisms. As I said, that's not a scary thing. Having a complaints mechanism is a good way to ensure you're catching problems and addressing them before they get too bad. And communicate about your efforts. I know it's oftentimes a scary thing because there's a fear, don't I open up myself to potential additional liabilities when I start saying here's what I'm doing and I'm not successful at it? Actually, it turns out it's more the other way around. It's better to talk about what you're doing to show that you're doing your due diligence, because should you unfortunately ever be faced with a potential lawsuit, it's best to say, look, here's what I'm doing. I'm meeting industry best practices. It's not a guarantee, but it's the best I could have done.